Mike woke up suddenly, as if he had broken out of a deep oblivion. A feeling of cold pierced him to the bone when he realized that he was lying on a smooth metal surface. His breathing was erratic, and every attempt to inhale cut his throat, as if the air around him was saturated with electric charges. Everything around was alien and unfamiliar, no familiar earthly landscapes or sounds. He didn't know where he was. But one thing was obvious: it wasn't Earth. Slowly recovering, Mike felt the cold floor beneath him with his hands and felt a faint vibration, as if invisible mechanisms were moving somewhere below. This continuous pulsation filled the space around him, and everything seemed saturated with a strange, intense energy. His head was still spinning, but he gradually got to his feet, trying to look around and understand what was happening. The hall he was in was huge. The walls, ceiling, and floor were made of the same cold, silvery metal. Everything around radiated a dim, barely noticeable light, which gave the room a sterility and lifelessness. The space around seemed empty and cold, without any signs of human activity or comfort. Mike's every step was accompanied by a feeling as if the very air was charged with electricity, and his presence here seemed incredible. Mike couldn't remember how he got here. His last memories were blurred. He was just walking home after another normal day at work. Everything was familiar, normal, and then a sharp lapse in memory. Now he was standing in this huge room, and every cell in his body told him that he was far from home. The feeling that he had left the earth was almost tangible. Fear began to creep into his mind, giving rise to many questions that he could not find answers to. Mike's attention was distracted by four silhouettes that slowly emerged from the shadows on the opposite side of the hall. They moved confidently and smoothly. Their steps were almost noiseless, but every movement caused anxiety and tension. As they approached, Mike was able to make out details and realized that they were women but not people. Their skin was dark blue, reminiscent of the depths of the ocean, and their eyes shone with a bright green light, radiating an indescribable power and mystery. Their long black hair streamed down their backs, giving the impression that they were moving with these strange creatures, enhancing their unusual beauty. Three of the women were clad in armor that clung tightly to their slender, muscular bodies. Their movements were precise and confident, and on the belt of each hung a futuristic weapon, the shape of which was as alien as the warriors themselves. This armor not only emphasized their strength, but also gave them the appearance of ruthless guards ready to act at any second. The fourth woman, standing slightly apart from the others, clearly held a leading position. Her appearance was different from the others. She wasn't wearing armor, but her figure and posture radiated undeniable power. Her presence filled the entire space, and Mike felt a surge of fear in his chest. Looking at her, he realized that she was the key figure among these strange creatures. The silence in the hall was deafening. Only the hum of energy vibrated around, creating a tense atmosphere. Mike felt his heart pounding and his mind desperately searching for some explanation of what was happening. He was alone in this alien world, surrounded by strange creatures, and every second he spent here seemed endless. Panic was building inside him, but he knew he had to keep his mind clear, even if everything looked like a dream. As the women got closer, the tension in the air became noticeably dense, as if every molecule of space was being squeezed by the weight of their presence. Majestic and frightening, they stopped in front of Mike, and it seemed to him that time had slowed down. Every step of these creatures was filled with unspeakable power, and now that he was standing right in front of them, he felt tiny and vulnerable. Their height, which was much higher than a human's, left him no chance to feel safe. The three armored women stood perfectly straight, their faces impassive, as if they were machines and not living beings. Despite their grace, there was a deadly danger in their movements and postures. Each of their actions seemed to be calibrated to the smallest detail, as if they were trained to respond to any threat instantly and without hesitation. Their eyes, glowing green, were fixed on Mike, but they did not express any emotions, neither curiosity nor hostility, just a cold, icy look that chilled him to the bone. However, this fourth creature, standing slightly behind the three, immediately attracted his attention more than all the others. At first glance, she looked less threatening. The lack of armor and weapons made her not look like a warrior like her companions. But it was she who radiated more than just strength. She was the epitome of power. Tall, with a proud bearing, her movement was not as aggressive as the others, but there was a sense of grandeur in her every step. Her eyes, despite the same green fire, seemed more penetrating, more alive. That look was directed directly at Mike, and he realized that he was in the presence of a being whose decisions could change his fate. Lady Arya, that name popped up in his mind, as if it was prompted by something deep inside him. Even without knowing where this knowledge came from, Mike instinctively sensed her leadership position. Every detail of her behavior spoke of unquestionable power. It wasn't just physical dominance, but something much deeper. Lady Arya didn't need armor or weapons to control what was happening. Her presence alone was strong enough to inspire awe and fear. Mike froze, not knowing what to do next. He was afraid to make even one wrong move, as he did not know exactly what these creatures might mean and what their intentions were. Everything that was happening seemed too strange and frightening, and at the same time there was something attractive about Lady Arya, like some mysterious force that he could not fully understand, but he felt her power over him. She came closer, her figure gliding smoothly, almost noiselessly, as if she did not touch the floor. Her eyes never left Mike, and that look was piercing, as if she could see right through him. For the first time, he felt goosebumps running down his skin. Lady Arya didn't say a word, but her silence was more eloquent than any dialogue. It seemed to be something more sinister and deeper, as if she already knew everything she could say, and this knowledge made her invulnerable. Mike couldn't look away. He felt something inside him resisting instincts, perhaps trying to escape or at least not to meet that gaze. But it was impossible to escape the feeling that now he was trapped in this situation, as in a cage, and no matter what he did, the future was already sealed. Lady Arya stopped a step away from him, and her presence seemed to consume the entire space between them. There was more to her eyes than just the cold. There was something ancient, something indescribably strong. She was in no hurry to speak, her silence creating a tension that could not be ignored. Mike could feel his body tensing with every passing second as she just stood in front of him, looking straight into his eyes. There was a whole universe hidden in that look, full of innuendos and mysteries, but at the same time the essence of her interest in him remained hidden. There was almost absolute silence around them, except for the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the ship, which they seemed to be able to hear only because of this silence. Lady Arya finally slowly raised her hand, and the movement was both calm and threatening. Her gesture was smooth, as if she controlled not only her body but also the space around her. It seemed that her movements controlled the very reality around her, as if the space obeyed her will. The wave of her hand was unhurried, but Mike felt a sudden surge of energy emanating from this gesture. The air around him trembled, as if under the influence of an invisible force. Lady Arya showed no emotion, but her silent action suggested that she was testing how influenced he was, how he reacted to her power. At some point it seemed to him that the energy around him was thickening, as if the atmosphere itself was closing in on him in a trap. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to breathe, as if the pressure was increasing. His heart was beating faster, and his body instinctively tensed in an attempt to prepare for any possible outcome. Although Lady Arya wasn't doing anything threatening directly, her influence on the space around her was so obvious that Mike couldn't ignore it. His gaze met her piercing eyes again. At that moment, it seemed to him that time had stopped. All his thoughts seemed to blur, and the only thing he could focus on was that green light in her eyes, like a magnet pulling his consciousness. Inside those eyes, Mike saw a power that went beyond human understanding, and he began to realize that its power was not limited only to the physical world. Lady Arya could control not only the surrounding space, but also affect the mind. It was like an obsession. There was something ancient in her gaze, something that had existed much longer than his own life, than anything he knew about the world. This feeling of power and control was overwhelming. Mike felt all his attempts to resist disappear, and he just stood there, paralyzed by her presence. He couldn't move or look away, immersed in this invisible flow between them. Although Lady Arya didn't make a sound, Mike felt something in her presence that could be compared to mental pressure. It was like a silent order that he couldn't ignore. An invisible force penetrated his consciousness more and more, and he realized that she was not just watching him, she was studying him. She knew every minute reaction of his body, every fluctuation of his thoughts. Mike began to realize that she could read him, feel his fears, his doubts. At some point, the tension became so palpable that Mike almost fainted from the pressure that was rolling over him every moment. However, it was at this moment that Lady Arya's strength weakened. She took a step back, and the air in the room began to move again. The pressure dropped. It was like a sudden return to reality after a nightmare. Mike could feel his mind starting to regain control of his body again, but the fear that had entered his consciousness wouldn't let him go. It became clear to him that Lady Arya now knew everything she needed to know about him. She could see his fears, his weaknesses, his human nature, but most importantly, she appreciated his potential. And now her searching gaze has been replaced by confidence. There was no need to study her movements anymore. Now she knew what this man was capable of. Mike couldn't tell exactly what was going on in her head, but he felt that this meeting was more than a simple test. All this time that she was standing in front of him, it seemed that she was deciding something important and decisive for their further interaction. Now that his study of her was complete, Mike felt like he was part of something bigger, something that was beyond his comprehension. The three women standing behind Lady Arya continued to remain motionless. Their cold eyes were still watching Mike, but now they looked at him differently. It seemed that after interacting with their leader, their attitude towards him had changed. Maybe they saw something different in him now, something more than just a prisoner. There was a faint shadow of recognition in their gazes, although they remained cold and aloof. Now that the tension in the air had subsided a little, Mike felt his body slowly begin to relax, although his mind was still on edge. He tried to figure out what it all meant, but so far there were no obvious answers. The situation remained mysterious, and the future seemed full of uncertainty. He didn't know what to expect next, but one thing was clear: his life had changed forever, and this world full of strange creatures and incredible powers would not let him go so easily. His mind raced in search of at least some kind of plan, but the realization that he was just a pawn in a big game was unbearably strong. Mike felt cornered, and the only way he saw in front of him was to accept that he would have to follow these creatures further, especially Lady Arya. Her power was absolute, and now she knew she could use him as she saw fit. A feeling of hopelessness flashed through Mike's mind, as if he was no longer in control of his fate. He found himself in a world where the rules were different, where he did not understand either the events or the motivations of the creatures around him. He could only wait to see what would happen next and hope that it would not lead to his death. Lady Arya, having finished her silent examination, took a step back, but her gaze continued to be directed at Mike. It was as if she was considering the next step, and at that moment he realized that, despite all her power, there was a hidden plan in her actions that she knew but was still inaccessible to him. Mike stood petrified with tension in the silent hall when the world around him suddenly changed. All this time he was lost in his own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened in the last few moments and who these creatures were. Lady Arya, her warriors, and their mysterious behavior seemed to be in control of the situation, as if every movement and look had been planned in advance. However, reality quickly proved to him that even in this strange alien world, things happen that get out of control. Suddenly, the hall shook as if an invisible wave had hit the ship. The walls and floors shook, causing Mike to stagger. The vibrations were so powerful that it seemed as if the very structure of the ship had been subjected to a sudden attack. Somewhere in the distance, there was a dull metallic hum, as if a huge mechanism was bursting at the seams. For a moment, Mike thought it was a system error or internal damage to the ship, but soon realized it was something much more serious. The three warriors reacted instantly to the tremors. Their reaction was lightning fast, as if it was a familiar event for them. They stepped forward synchronously, almost as one, protecting Lady Arya with their bodies. Their weapons were instantly at the ready, and their eyes seemed to flash even brighter as a reaction to the threat. Their every move was precise, and without the slightest hint of panic. Mike was surprised to see how quickly everything changed from their calm, almost static posture to combat readiness. Not even a second had passed. The world around began to fill with sounds that had previously been muffled by the sterile silence of the hall. Sirens rang out, piercing the air, making Mike's ears pop at their volume. These signals were not just a warning about an internal problem, they screamed about an impending disaster. And although Mike didn't understand the meaning of these sounds, his instincts made it clear that the threat was real. He felt his pulse quicken with each new vibration. Lady Arya, however, remained calm, her face showing not the slightest sign of concern. It was a contrast that puzzled Mike. There was an obvious crisis going on in front of him, but she seemed to know what to do. Her hands were lowered, her gaze was directed somewhere deep into the room, as if she was analyzing what was happening and had already made a decision. It seemed that even in moments of chaos, her mind remained cool, full of calculation. Mike, on the other hand, was completely confused. He didn't know how to react, didn't understand what was going on around him. All he could do was just watch these alien creatures act with absolute intensity. He felt helpless and vulnerable, like a tiny particle in a huge machine that was about to fall apart. His every nervous movement, every tremor of his hands reflected his inner panic. Suddenly, another blow shook the ship, and this time Mike almost fell, barely keeping his balance. The floor trembled underfoot, as if some invisible creature was breaking through the metal plates of the ship. He instinctively glanced at the ceiling, expecting to see cracks or breaks, but there was nothing like that. However, it was clear that something terrible was unfolding above them. Something or someone had attacked the ship, and that something clearly had tremendous power. At that moment, the lights in the hall began to blink. The entire space was filled with flashing lights, as if the ship's systems were trying to react to an impending threat. Every moment in the dark seemed like an eternity to Mike. His heart was beating so fast that it seemed like it was going to jump out of his chest. He couldn't figure out what was going on, but his body instinctively tensed up, preparing for something terrible. Lady Arya turned abruptly to her warriors. Her eyes met each of them, and although she didn't say a word, her message was very clear. Her bodyguards nodded wordlessly and instantly moved to the side, heading for the nearest exit from the hall. They moved quickly, but with amazing calmness and precision. Mike stood rooted to the spot, not understanding where they were going or what he should do. Before he could do anything, the space around him shook again, but this time, along with the trembling, there was a sound like an explosion. A rumble filled the room and Mike felt the ground beneath his feet begin to shake even more violently. The metal walls seemed ready to collapse, and for a moment he thought this was the end of him. It seemed that the entire structure could collapse at any moment. Then the ship suddenly plunged into darkness. All the lights went out instantly, and Mike found himself in total darkness. The sirens stopped as if someone had turned them off with a flick of their hand, and the silence became deafening. It was so unexpected that for a split second his mind couldn't react to the change of scenery. In this dense darkness, he could see and hear nothing but his own heavy breathing and pounding heart. Panic began to take hold of him. He was standing in the center of a completely unfamiliar place, surrounded by strange creatures, and now even the faint lights and sounds that helped him navigate somehow disappeared. At that moment, he felt completely lost, as if he was in the very depths of an endless void. Fear was growing in my head. But then, in this complete silence and darkness, something changed. Mike felt a slight vibration in the air, as if someone or something was slowly approaching. He tensed, listening to this subtle noise. His heart was pounding wildly in his chest again, and although he couldn't see or pinpoint the source of the sound, his instincts told him that something important was happening right in front of him. And suddenly the light came on again, illuminating the room with a soft, dim glow. It wasn't the bright light that had illuminated the hall earlier, but it was enough for Mike to see the surrounding area. He looked back and saw that Lady Arya was still standing motionless like a statue, her gaze directed somewhere in the distance. Her face maintained the same cold, unflappable look, and it struck Mike again. It seemed that even the complete darkness and the sudden threat could not break her concentration. But then his attention was attracted by new sounds coming from outside the hall. The metallic claps, like footsteps on a heavy steel floor, grew louder. Mike tensed instinctively, his breath coming in short gasps. He realized that someone was approaching. The shadows outside the doors of the hall began to move, and Mike felt the tension around him rise sharply. The doors of the hall opened, and two figures appeared on the threshold. They were different from Lady Arya and her warriors. They were humans, or at least creatures that looked like humans. Their faces were hidden under black helmets, and their bodies were clad in black armored suits, sparkling with their every movement. Mike didn't know who they were, but his instincts told him they weren't allies. These creatures didn't look like protectors or friends. These people entered the hall with a confident step. Their movements were fast, and before Mike could react in any way, they raised their weapons. Mike's gaze fell on the shiny barrels of their strange devices, and suddenly the world slowed down for him again. He felt his heart stop for a split second, and then a deafening shot rang out. Mike didn't even have time to feel the pain. Everything happened so fast that his mind just didn't have time to realize what had happened. The world around him disappeared in an instant. The hum of the ship, the light, the figures of people and strange creatures all disappeared into the black void. The last thing he felt was the feeling of falling into endless darkness. When he came to his senses again, everything was different. The world was slowly returning to Mike, as if his consciousness was emerging from deep darkness. At first, the feeling of his body returned. He felt the cold metal under his wrists and ankles. Gradually, he began to realize that his arms and legs were firmly fixed in an uncomfortable position. The feeling of pressure on his wrists and ankles became more pronounced as he tried to move, but each jerk was accompanied by a sharp pain. Fear gripped him again, but now it was fear not only of the unknown but of utter helplessness. Mike opened his eyes, and a sterile, almost gloomy environment appeared before him. He was in a small room illuminated by a dim blue light that spread from the ceiling lamps. The walls around him were smooth, metallic, completely featureless, without a single window or decoration. The entire interior of the room was frighteningly functional. He instantly realized that this was not a hospital room or a place to rest. It was a cell specially designed to hold prisoners. Mike blinked several times, trying to focus his eyes and look around. His head was still spinning from the recent stun. He remembered those strange figures in black armor who had entered the hall and attacked him, and suddenly the realization of what had happened brought him back to reality. These were not Lady Arya's allies, not her warriors. They were outsiders, probably enemies, and now he was their prisoner. There was a faint rustle in the back of the room, and Mike reflexively turned his head towards the source of the sound. At first he couldn't see anything in the dim light, but then a figure appeared in front of him. Lady Arya was standing at the entrance to the room. Her eyes were still glowing green, but now there was something different in her gaze, seriousness and some anxiety that she hadn't shown before. Unlike her usual companions, she was alone now. Her presence, however, filled the room with heavy tension. Mike couldn't say a word, but his mind was racing from one question to another. What happened? Why is he here? What role is assigned to him in this situation? Lady Arya stared at him intently, and it seemed that she knew all the answers without even asking questions. Her silence was frightening, but at the same time strangely comforting, as if she had come not to do harm, but to explain what awaits him next. She slowly came closer. Her movements were almost silent, but each of them made Mike's heart beat faster. Stopping in front of him, she leaned towards him and her cold fingers touched his forehead, as if checking his condition. Her touch was strange. There was strength in it, but not aggression. It was like a test, an assessment of his physical condition. Mike felt as if her gaze penetrated his mind, studying him from the inside. Her face remained unreadable, but he understood that she knew a lot more about him than he could have guessed. At one point, he even felt that she might understand his thoughts. But then, almost suddenly, her hands pulled away and she straightened up. The room fell silent again. Lady Arya stood motionless in front of him, and Mike, despite his helpless position, began to realize that his role in this situation was much more important than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a kidnapping or a chance encounter. He had to do something significant, something that was beyond his comprehension. It took several long minutes before Lady Arya began to act. She took a step back and touched the bracelet on her wrist. A moment later, a thin thread of light shot out, which stretched between her palm and Mike's handcuffs. To his surprise, the bindings that held his wrists and ankles loosened and released him with a soft click. Mike, startled by the unexpected freedom, lowered his arms and tried to stand up, but his legs were too weak to support his weight. Lady Arya remained silent, watching him. Mike couldn't figure out exactly what she was up to, but her behavior had changed. She no longer looked as aloof as she had in the first moments of their meeting. Now there was a hidden purpose in her eyes that Mike couldn't figure out yet. He was still under the influence of shock, but he instinctively felt that now it was time to find out the truth. When his legs were finally able to support his weight, Lady Arya pointed to a small passage in the wall that opened behind her. The light behind it was dimmed, and Mike felt a slight gust of wind, as if it were some kind of ventilation tunnel. Arya motioned for him to follow her, and he realized that he had no choice. He didn't know what was waiting for him beyond this passage, but apparently the answers were there. They were walking down a narrow corridor, and the silence between them was not broken. Unlike the spacious hall where Mike first saw Lady Arya and her warriors, this tunnel was much less majestic. The walls here were uneven and seemed less processed, and the floor swayed slightly under their feet, as if they were walking through some kind of technical area of the ship. Mike felt a slight vibration under his feet, and his mind drew images of huge machines working somewhere in the depths of the ship, keeping it in working order. Finally, they came to a large oval entrance, which slowly opened as Lady Arya approached it. The room they entered was completely different from the previous one. This was the heart of the ship, or at least one of its key rooms. The center of the room was occupied by a massive device, similar to a generator, from which weak streams of energy emanated. Metal cables hung from the ceiling, connecting to the floor and walls, and numerous screens on the walls displayed complex diagrams and data that Mike could not understand. Lady Arya stopped in front of the device, and Mike froze, not knowing what would happen next. At that moment, she began to speak. Her voice was firm and determined, but without threat. Mike finally realized that she was explaining something important to him. Her words, although they sounded like orders, were more like an introduction to the essence of the events to which he now found himself tied. She began to tell him about her mission, her people, and what had happened on their ship. They were on the run from a powerful faction that sought to take over their world. This ship is not just a means of transportation, but a key element of the struggle for the freedom of her people. And Mike somehow became an important part of their plan. It wasn't an accident that he ended up here. His abduction was not a matter of chance, and his presence on the ship was part of a carefully planned operation. Lady Arya said that their technologies are closely related to emotional and mental states. Their people had the ability to harness the energy hidden in their bodies and minds, but to activate this power they needed an external catalyst, someone from another race whose emotional and physical characteristics were suitable to synchronize with their technology. Mike turned out to be the very person who could activate the hidden capabilities of their ship. He was the key to the liberation of her people. Lady Arya explained that the ship contained a special energy system capable of destroying enemy forces, but this system required activation, which could only be performed by a person with certain qualities. Mike had these qualities, and that's why they chose him. His role now was to help them complete the activation process, without which they were doomed. Mike stood there, stunned by what he had heard. He could never have imagined that his ordinary life on Earth would lead him to such a moment. But now, realizing his importance to this mission, he realized that he had no choice. After Lady Arya finished her explanation, the room fell into a tense silence. The words she said were still echoing in Mike's head. He was standing in front of a giant device that she said was the key to saving her people. Mike tried to comprehend the scale of what was happening. Everything he had learned seemed unreal to him. It seemed impossible to a man who lived an ordinary life on Earth that the fate of an entire alien civilization now depended on him. However, deep down he had already begun to realize that there was no turning back. All that remained was to move forward. Lady Arya turned to him, her gaze firm and unwavering. He saw something in her eyes that drove him to action, a mixture of determination and expectation. Her people needed him, and he knew it. All the doubts that tormented him gradually receded before the greatness of the task before him. Mike took a step forward, hesitantly approaching the device. The energy streams around him made a quiet hum, and he felt a faint vibration in the air. At first glance, it seemed like a complex machine that was controlled by unknown technologies, but Lady Arya assured that interaction with her would be tied to his emotions and mental concentration. Not mechanical knowledge, but emotional connection and harmony were supposed to activate this ancient system. It sounded so strange and alien, but Mike knew that he would have to trust this process. As he approached the central generator, he felt as if something had awakened in response to his presence. An invisible force enveloped him, as if the machine was beginning to recognize him, and the energy flows began to pulse more strongly. Lady Arya, who was standing nearby, was watching the scene closely. She did not interfere, but her presence was felt as strongly as before. She trusted Mike, but that trust was fragile. He felt he couldn't let her and her people down. Slowly, with concentration, Mike stretched out his hand towards the device. At the same moment, a faint spark started from his fingers, as if his touch had awakened a dormant force. The entire space around the generator shone with a soft light that began to spread along the walls and ceiling, turning the room into something like a pulsating living organism. He felt his own breathing begin to synchronize with the rhythm of this energy, and his mind began to clear of unnecessary thoughts. But before he could focus on activating the device, a powerful explosive sound suddenly rang out, shaking the walls of the ship. The room shook as if it was shaking from the inside. Mike abruptly recoiled from the device, and Lady Arya, who had remained calm until that moment, tensed. An expression of wariness appeared on her face, and she quickly glanced at the screens hanging on the walls. The ship's system has apparently detected an external threat. And again the sirens pierced the air, this time even louder and more aggressive. Mike could feel the vibrations from the sirens merging with the hum of the generator, creating a chaotic feeling of complete system failure. Lady Arya quickly went to the control panel, and her fingers instantly worked over the buttons and touchscreens. Mike didn't know what she was doing, but her concentration and confidence in her actions showed that she was ready for such a development. It took only a few seconds, but those seconds were enough for everything to change. The screens that used to be filled with symbols and data streams now have an image. It was a map of the ship, and it clearly marked the points of external penetration. Mike saw several red signals spreading across various parts of the ship, and this was an alarming sign the ship was under attack. Lady Arya turned to him and nodded, making it clear that the situation had changed and they needed to act quickly. She directed his attention back to the generator, showing that activating the system was not just part of their plan, it was now a critical step to survive and keep control of the ship. As long as the enemies continued to attack, the generator could be their only hope of salvation. But before Mike could focus on the device again, the doors of the room burst open and several figures in black armor rushed into it. These were the same people who had attacked him earlier. Now they had made their way into the very heart of the ship. Lady Arya reacted instantly. Her movements were fast and precise. A strange energy sword appeared in her hands, which flashed with a bright light. She stood between Mike and the attackers, ready to defend herself. Mike took a few steps back, realizing that he was not ready for such aggression. He had seen Lady Arya coolly fighting the black-armored warriors, her movements graceful and deadly. She deflected the blows with ease, as if every step had been calibrated to the smallest detail. Explosions of light, the sounds of blows and the whistling of energy filled the room, and Mike could barely keep track of what was happening. But despite her skill, the enemies did not give up. There were many of them, and each of them was equipped with sophisticated weapons. They attacked without delay. Their goal was clearly to destroy Lady Arya and seize control of the ship. Mike realized that if he didn't help, everything could end in disaster for her. Looking around, Mike noticed several technology panels that could be useful. He ran to the nearest one, hoping to find something that could help in this situation. Lacking the skills to work with alien technology, he acted blindly, his fingers frantically pressing on the touch panels, hoping to disable enemies or activate protective mechanisms. To his surprise, one of the panels began to react to his actions. One of the ship's security systems, as it turned out, could be activated manually, and Mike, using intuition, was able to turn on the automatic turrets. Turrets suddenly moved out of the ceiling of the room and instantly opened fire on the enemies. A stream of plasma bolts crossed the room, knocking down several black-armored soldiers. This gave Lady Arya the necessary respite to destroy the remaining ones. She moved with incredible speed, her sword flashed in her hands, and every blow was deadly. Within a few moments, the battle was over and the remaining enemies were defeated. Silence filled the room again. Mike stood panting, realizing what had just happened. Lady Arya approached him, her face remaining calm despite what had happened. She nodded her thanks to him, though she didn't say a word. This tacit admission was eloquent enough for him. She had trusted him, and now that trust had been confirmed by his actions. However, the danger has not passed. Even though the enemies were defeated, their attack meant that the enemies had broken into the ship and could attack again. They needed to act quickly to complete the activation of the generator and take control of the ship's system. Lady Arya directed Mike back to the generator and showed him again what needed to be done. Time was running out. Mike stood in front of the device again, and this time he didn't hesitate. He stretched out his hand, and the energy around him instantly responded to his touch. The streams of light began to pulse through the room again, but now their rhythm became more intense, as if the device recognized it and was preparing to activate. Mike felt the tension building inside him, as if he was connecting to something much bigger than just a car. His mind went into a state of complete concentration. He felt his emotions and mental energy begin to connect with the device. The feeling was strange, but at the same time natural. Mike became part of a process that was designed not for a machine, but for a living being. He felt the system responding to his inner state, synchronizing with his thoughts and emotions. And at that moment, the light flashed brighter. The generator began to work at full power, and streams of energy spread throughout the ship. When the generator finally activated, the whole room was illuminated by a blinding light so bright that Mike momentarily lost the ability to see. The whole ship literally breathed new life, and Mike felt his body and mind become part of this energy system. It was both a mesmerizing and frightening feeling, as if his own energy had synchronized with a giant machine, and for a moment he felt like an integral part of something immeasurably greater than himself. The generator began to emit a deep vibrating hum that reverberated in his chest and filled the entire space around. But it wasn't just a mechanical device. Mike realized that this machine was responding to his thoughts, his emotions, and his condition. With each breath he took, the light in the room changed, the vibration increased or decreased, as if everything that was happening around him was under his control. Energy pulsed across the floor, walls, and ceiling, creating an invisible network that encompassed the entire ship. Lady Arya stood nearby, watching the scene, her face calm, but her eyes shone with a fire of determination. She knew that the moment of truth had come, and that the fate of her people now depended not only on her, but also on Mike. Although she still didn't say a word, her confidence was transmitted to him. Mike felt that she believed in his abilities, that he would be able to complete what he had started. However, the tension in the air was growing by the second. They both knew that this was only the beginning of their battle for control of the ship and possibly for the salvation of her people. By activating the generator, they took the first step towards victory, but the enemies still remained on the ship. The enemies were not going to give up without a fight. This was clear from the way the ship's systems began to respond to external attacks. Red indicators on the panels, vibrations along the hull, alarm signals coming from afar. Mike faced a huge task. He was a man who had never faced anything like this, and now his role in this conflict has become central. Despite all his insecurities, he knew he had to keep going. Lady Arya pointed to the control panel, suggesting that he take control of the following actions. At that moment, Mike felt that he should not only trust his instincts, but also fully focus on the task on which their lives depended. As soon as he touched the touchpad, a slight tremor ran through his fingers, as if the ship itself was reacting to his presence. The systems began to activate one by one, and Mike was surprised to realize that his interaction with the ship no longer required complex commands. All he had to do was direct his thoughts and emotions. And the ship responded. Various circuits, signals, and visual displays began to appear on the screens in front of him. Mike saw how the security systems blocked access to the main sections of the ship, cutting off enemies from vital components. He also noticed how the energy fields were strengthening around the core, protecting the generator from further attacks. His actions not only activated the defenses but also enhanced the ship's capabilities, creating protection against intruders. But that wasn't all. Mike knew that just defending himself wasn't enough. The enemies had already penetrated inside, and their main goal was either to destroy or capture the ship. They had to find a way to neutralize the remaining invaders before they dealt an irreparable blow. At that moment, Mike felt the tension in his body increase. He knew he had to figure out how to deal with a situation that was already beyond his capabilities. Lady Arya, seeing that Mike was starting to lose his concentration, came closer. She put her hand on his shoulder, a light touch, but enough to get his attention back. Her eyes were full of confidence, and it gave Mike the support he needed. He gathered all his strength and focused on the screens in front of him again. Pulling himself together, he began to look for a way to disable the enemy systems inside the ship. He had to work fast. He knew they didn't have much time. The enemies could break through to them at any moment. But at that moment, as if on cue, the doors swung open again. Several soldiers dressed in black armor, already familiar to Mike, burst into the hall. Their steps were fast, and they moved with a clear purpose. It seemed that they were ready to take control of them or destroy them. But Mike, now fully focused on his task, did not get lost. He activated one of the protective fields that surrounded the central core of the generator. Instantly, a transparent energy curtain appeared around them, preventing the enemies from approaching them. The soldiers tried to attack, but their weapons were unable to break through this energy barrier. Lady Arya didn't wait for the next step. Her movements were fast and precise. She, as before, showed her incredible combat training by throwing out a sword that glowed with a bright blue light. In a matter of seconds, she cut through the ranks of soldiers moving towards them. Her skill was impeccable, but the number of enemies was growing by the second. Mike, seeing that the fight was getting more complicated, made a decision that changed the course of events. He remembered that at the very beginning, when the ship's system had just been activated, Lady Arya had mentioned the special ability of this generator, the possibilities not only of defense, but also of attack. Now he had to use this energy to hit the enemies with devastating force. He didn't know what it would lead to, but they had no other choice. Mike touched the control panel again, closing his eyes and focusing on his inner energy. He felt the ship responding to his thoughts, and directing all his will to control the energy field, he released a powerful impulse. The streams of light that had been pulsating around the generator up to that moment increased dramatically and flashed with bright rays, like a supernova explosion. The whole room was flooded with this light, and Mike felt his own energy merge with the ship, amplifying the momentum. This energy explosion engulfed all the enemies who had made their way into the room. The black-armored soldiers instantly fell, unable to withstand this incredible power. The generator's field turned out to be so strong that it destroyed all their systems and neutralized any weapons they used. It was like a wave of power, destroying everything in its path, but leaving Mike and Lady Arya unharmed. When the flash of light went out, the ship was again plunged into silence. Everything froze. Mike stood panting, his body overcome with fatigue, but at the same time he felt an extraordinary relief. It was all over. Lady Arya came up to him, her eyes still glowing with a bright green light, but now you could read gratitude in them. She knew they couldn't have done it without him. Mike was finally able to relax. He felt the tension go away, and his body began to release the accumulated fatigue. Lady Arya directed him to leave the room, and the two of them left the heart of the ship. There were no enemies on their way. Their mission was completed successfully. When they returned to the main deck, Lady Arya activated the navigation system. She entered the coordinates, and Mike realized that it was time to return home. He was still under the impression of everything that had happened and could not believe that all this had really happened to him. But the ship began to move, and soon the familiar contours of the Earth loomed in front of them. Mike was lost in thought as they approached the moment of the final farewell. Lady Arya turned to him, her face a mixture of regret and gratitude. She knew that they were connected now and their paths could still cross, but she also understood that he had to return to his home planet. Mike understood this himself, but despite everything that had happened, he realized that his life would never be the same again. The ship hovered over the Earth, and Mike felt a familiar pull towards his planet. He took one last look at Lady Arya before the teleportation portal activated. The world around him changed again, and in a few moments he found himself in the middle of a busy city, surrounded by people who had no idea what he had been through. The Earth accepted him again, but Mike knew that he was no longer just a man.